I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into this. Okay, guys, in this video, we're going to talk about the fact that there are elves and there are humans in Dungeons and Dragons. But in mythology, there was also these things called half-elves. And Dungeons and Dragons, original Dungeons and Dragons, also had those in their world as well. So Supplement 1, Greyhawk, talks about the fact that elves actually are a thing that exists and that they can be thieves. This makes one of the rare ways you can get into what I call the tri-class, is in 3 different classes. Elves can be this when they can become thieves, and so can half-elves. Half-elves, potentially, depending on how you rule this in your own game, could have 2 ways to get there, or really 3. But I'll get that in a second. Okay, so what else can half-elves be? Well, they can be fighters, which technically means that they can also be paladins if they're lawful. They can be illusionists because they can become magic users. And I haven't gotten into the illusionist class yet. I will be discussing that in a future video when I get to Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry, and when I talk about the effects of strategic review and what it says about illusionists there too. Now, in addition to this, there's some debate, or a lot, depending on what circle of friends you're with, about half-elves being clerics. And if they can be clerics and they are of neutral alignment, then they could also become a druid. Also, a different class and a different rule book. When I get to Supplement 2, Blackmore, I'll talk about that. So let's go ahead and jump into what half-elves can be. Typically, they are fighter magic users as they basically adopt the elven side for leveling. That means that they level in both at the same time, but they're only one of these classes at a time. They have slightly different caps, where the magic user caps at 8 in the elf, and the fighter caps as a 4th. On the half-elf, they're both at 6. Now, Supplement 1 actually increases these caps depending on what their exceptional intelligence or strength is. But I'll talk about that also in a future video, because this video will be too long if I try to talk about all these things in one video. It'd be like the 1974 original Dungeons & Dragons video I made that was a very long 2-hour video. And when you look at the illusionist, as I'm going back to this class again, it basically says it's default magic user. So anything that can be a magic user can technically be a illusionist. Now, classically, a gnome fits that, but that's probably a different influence and not really a thing in original Dungeons & Dragons. So let's just go ahead and rip the band-aid off and talk about probably one of the more controversial things with half-elves. Let's talk about clerics. So there are a lot of things that are clearly stated, yet are very contradictory to themselves. I refer to it as the text is arguing with itself because it doesn't agree. For example, it says, and I quote, "There are no half-elf clerics." And then there is a comma. And then it clearly states right after that, "For in this regard, their human side prevails." What? The human side? Wouldn't that be the elven side? Because humans can be clerics. So can they be clerics because the human side prevail, or can they not be clerics because the elven side prevails? Because elves can't be clerics in original Dungeons & Dragons. So that's not right. Surely that would be the end of it, right? Nay. No. It clearly goes on and makes some more sentences that clearly don't agree with each other. And I'm using the word clearly here so many times because it's so ridiculous. And these sentences do not agree with each other or with themselves. I consider this next part probably a typo when it talks about the elf side prevails, potentially, but that doesn't necessarily make sense because literally the next sentence says this: "But half-elves with a wisdom of 13 or higher may also become clerics." Really? Now they can become clerics, where literally a sentence before that they both could and could not become clerics? So now I say they can be clerics. However, the text is not done arguing with itself, and it continues. It states, as it says, it splits XP evenly between the fighter, the magic user, and the cleric, creating a potential, what I call, tri-class. Now, I want to ignore this version of it there's a heap of grammar issues as you saw the paragraph scroll by. Because in book 1, Men in Magic, on page 9 in my PDF, it clearly states that in any event, magic users cannot become clerics and vice versa. Now, this is in reference to changing class, under the changing class header for that paragraph. And what I believe that is trying to say is they didn't want a cleric to go become like second level, have cure light wounds, and then become a magic user, okay? Be able to turn undead as a second level cleric, be able to cast a cure light wounds or whatever else they might be able to do, and then be able to then go and cast magic missile and sleep and all those other things, being the perfect thing at like level 3 for both undead and the living at the same time, and being able to heal. That would be very min-max. Read anything in modern day from like 3rd edition on, and you really will see a lot of min-maxing. And I think they're really trying to stop that early on. So that's my interpretation of what the rules were saying. In that case, I would have the fighter cleric or the fighter magic user. I wouldn't make it a tri-class. I'd make that a tri-class if you picked up thief. Then you would have fighter, cleric, thief, or fighter, magic user, thief. And of course, fighter could be inversed for paladin. So you could have a paladin cleric thief or a paladin magic user thief, because a paladin is a subclass of that. If you watch my paladin video, which is already out, you can see where I talk about those type of things. So if you allow clerics, this unreels some interesting thought processes, because it continues saying that the level cap for a cleric is 4th level. So I really do feel like they meant to have half elves as clerics, not elves, but half elves, because that's the human side that prevails, right? So if you're going to have clerics, and you're going to have up to 4th level clerics, unless maybe you have a really high wisdom, then you are looking at potentially having druids, which then makes that even a more interesting thing, because you couldn't do a paladin and a druid because of alignment restrictions, which is one of the few times you'll ever hear that in original Dungeons and Dragons, is you can't have those two together like that. But you could be a fighter druid thief, and that would be interesting. Whether you allow clerics as half elves or not, I think you should. I think it totally changes the game if you do, but I don't think it breaks anything. If you want to leave that as purely a human thing, I don't think that's a big problem. So we've talked a lot about the classes. Let's talk about some of the half-elf abilities and continue sort of the confusion where things were not clearly wrote, even though they were so clear on something that was so confusing earlier. Okay, so let's talk about the half-elf abilities. Well, they get the elven side for hidden doors, but they don't get the elven side when it comes to fighting things like orcs and these type of things. And they don't get, I assume, the split move type of thing that elves get from chainmail. That would be a completely different thing as well. Also from chainmail, though, there are some other things that would probably get left out as well. For example, they probably don't count as an elf when rolling on the fantasy chart. See, on the fantasy chart, specifically, elves are an entry. So are heroes, so are superheroes, so are wizards. But elves themselves are an entry, which means that they are able to kill a chimera at first level if they roll high because they're an elf. Now, you can decide whether Aragorn falls into that category or not, or something of that nature. But that's kind of what we're talking about with that. That's one of the abilities they probably would lose according to the rules. How you do it at your table is your own thing. But there is a very important thing that was left out, and I feel like we need to talk about it. You see, they don't see it in the darkness. There's nothing in here about infravision. I personally would side with the elf on vision because they're able to see doors and sense doors and this type of stuff. And I'm not against giving more races or more people in my game infravision. I think that it kind of makes the lack of improvision special when you don't have it. Sort of like having a low stat. It's kind of an important character building thing, leaving it to the humans and the halflings. But there is no discussion in Supplement 1 about improvision. This is only stated in Book 3, really, when it's talking about dwarves and elves get improvision, and there was no half-elves yet, so they are not included in this. And I think this is an oversight, and probably the elven side would prevail on this thing. I also like it because it's one more way for a thief to have improvision, which is a very important thing, without having to be an elf. Now, I run elves differently. I tend to pursue my own magic system. I call it lyrical magic. I give this to elves in lyrical magic real briefly. I'm going to do a video sometime talking about this. They don't memorize spells out of a spell book. They do have a way to memorize spells, but it's a more permanent version, kind of like a modern day sorcerer. They're able to recall it. They don't travel with a book. They're able to teach each other these new lyrics, and the music itself, the sound is very lyrical. It can be a cappella without an instrument, or you could have elves playing music, which I think is classic mythology in many ways. You hear about the haunting sounds of an elf and you feel a certain way. I just really feel like that is specifically good in a role-play game. Now, half-elves in my world would be able to choose human magic or lyrical magic, but they don't get both. And I would say you probably have to choose that at the beginning. Also, lyrical magic is both divine and arcane in my world, which means it, well, and technically primal, I guess, if you count druid, but it can be any of the magic user, cleric, or druid lines. Therefore, it could also be an illusionist thing, which makes it very close to a bard, which is a whole different thing. But I'll get into that when I talk about bards. Since we're talking about how I do something like with elves, how would I do it? How would I allow or make half-elves in my world? I would allow a half-elf to be a paladin, cleric, thief. I would allow them to be a fighter, druid, thief. I would allow them to be a paladin or fighter, magic user, thief. I would allow those things. I like it. I would give them improvision. It doesn't say that it's impossible for a thief to be lawful. It just basically says they want a reason. And I think that makes a lot of sense. It talks about how anti-chaotic half-elves are. And I think that really makes them lean towards the paladin side of things. And I really like this people's champion type of thing, adorned in leather, fighting for the people as a faithful leader who brings cause to some group through his presence and stance, and the fact that he's able to do these healings and these type of things. And then what people don't know is he will backstab the living crap out of anyone who is evil AF. That's kind of like a less talked about thing, something that's not put in the footnotes of history. But did I get this wrong? Did I get this right? Let me know down in the comments. How would you do, and what would you name a character like this, the people's champion? And let me know. Anyways, thank you guys. Keep rolling those dice and see you next one.